Hi everyone, welcome back to POT 4936, Democracy and Propaganda. This week we started reading Jason Stanley, and he is a little bit difficult. So if you're struggling, first of all, know that that's completely normal. Second of all, this is just an example of why I say you always have to read political theory twice. You just cannot expect yourself to be able to understand it on the first time. You will miss it. It will seem very confusing, and it'll seem like this person is talking about all sorts of things and none of it is being tied together. It is. It's just that you have to read very carefully and closely and more than once. Okay, so it's not something that's going to be immediately accessible the first time you glance at it. It takes work. I cannot emphasize that enough, you guys. You have to work to understand this stuff. So, but hang in there. I'm making these videos that will hopefully help you out. After you watch this video, go back and read the introduction again, and I swear it'll be like flipping a light switch. It will be a lot more clear, okay? So just know that you have to read things in political theory more than once. What I'm going to do in this video is three things. One, I'm going to talk again about what Jason Stanley's research question is. What is the problem that he's addressing? Why is it so important that we understand what problem he's trying to address? Two, I'm going to explain a little bit more about why Stanley talks about Plato. He doesn't just talk about Plato because he's a political theorist and everybody has to talk about Plato. There's a specific reason. There's 2 points that Jason Stanley takes away from Plato that are important to making his argument. So what are those 2 points? Three, the third thing I'm going to talk about is Stanley's point in bringing up the Detroit water crisis. We know he spends about half of the introduction talking about the Detroit water crisis. Why does he do that? It's really important to understand why, because this is what actually will connect his ideas back to Jacques Ellul. Okay? So if that sounds good, let's get started and I'll explain more on the next slide. Okay, remember how I said earlier in the semester that the key to analyzing an argument is to first identify what the issue is that the author is trying to address or the problem that they're trying to solve? Well, that's going to be key to understanding Stanley's argument here as well. If you notice at the beginning of the introduction, he spends a lot of time talking about this guy named Victor Klemperer. Why does Stanley do that? Well, the reason why is because he's trying to illustrate the problem that his book is intended to explain, okay? Which is what gets in the way of democracy. Why is it that we fail to live up to our ideals? How can we stop being hypocrites and actually enact the ideals that we profess to hold dear? These are the issues that Stanley is concerned with understanding. His main point in this book is not to point out that the U.S. is an unjust, undemocratic place. That's not his main point. His main point is why. Why is the U.S. undemocratic when it claims to be founded on the principles of democracy and freedom and equality? Why is there so much inequality and injustice in the United States? So if you say something like, well, Stanley's point is just to point out that the U.S. is a hypocritical nation, you're not going to get very many points for that kind of answer on the in-class essay, because that just shows that you missed the point of Stanley. The main point of Stanley is to explain why that is. We don't need anybody to tell us that the U.S. is unjust and doesn't live up to its ideals. All of us probably know that by now. What Stanley's trying to explain is why that is. What is the role of rhetoric in explaining that contradiction in terms, okay? So that's the research question of Jason Stanley. That's the problem that he's trying to solve in this book. So understanding that is the first step to understanding his argument as a whole, okay? In the next slide, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about why he talks also a lot about Plato in that first introduction chapter, okay? Okay, so there are 2 things that Stanley takes away from Plato. One is Plato's description of what a democratic culture values, and the other is how democracy can so easily slide into tyranny. those are the two main reasons for talking about Plato. Now in class, during the presentation and also during the lecture, we talked a lot about explaining Plato's 5 types of government and why he thought that democracy was the second to worst type of government, with the worst type of government being a tyranny. But that's not Jason Stanley's main point. We were just giving you that information to give you background. Stanley's main point in talking about Plato is that, Plato, when he's describing his 5 types of government, he describes what each of those different types of government value, right? He says an aristocracy values the best things. An oligarchy values wealth and money and property. A democracy values things like military honors and bravery and things like that, right? And then he says a democracy values freedom and equality. So that's what Stanley is focused on. Plato's description of what a democratic culture values, freedom and equality. And then his other point in bringing up Plato is to talk about why democracies can so easily slide into tyranny. Because he does agree with Plato about that too. Democracies can easily slide over into oppressive tyrannies. And why is that? That goes back to Jason Stanley's whole point of writing the book, the problem that he's trying to address. The issue that he's trying to address here is, why does democracy often fail to live up to its own ideals, right? So those are the 2 reasons why he talks about Plato. It's not because he concludes with Plato that democracy is the second to worst type of political system at all. He doesn't agree with that part, but what he does use Plato for is to describe what a democratic culture values and to describe how democracy can so easily degenerate into a more oppressive political system that we call tyranny. Okay? So that's the 2 clarifying points about Plato. Okay, so what is Stanley's example of the Detroit water crisis meant to illustrate? Right? So hint here, it connects Stanley's ideas to Ellul's ideas. So this part I think I did make clear in today's lecture, but here's a short recap in case it's helpful. Compare Jason Stanley's ideas on democracy, in other words, that he takes from Plato, what are the things that characterize a democratic society, and compare those to Jacques Ellul's description of democracy. There's a lot of overlap. They're both thinking about democracy in the same way. Okay, but why is Ellul so pessimistic about propaganda potentially aiding democracy? Ellul is very clear on this. He does not see any role for propaganda to help democracy. But why is that? Was it just that he lacked imagination and couldn't think of good advertising lines like Bernays could come up with? No, there's a very specific reason why Ellul was pessimistic that propaganda could increase democracy. And the reason has to do with how Ellul sees the modern technological world. And Stanley talks about a very similar idea, like I mentioned in the book. He talks about James Burnham's idea of the managerial society. This is a very, very similar concept to Jacques Ellul's concept of the technological society. So like I said in class, you could swap out all references to James Burnham in Jason Stanley's book and replace it with Jacques Ellul's concept of the technological society, and you'll have exactly the same argument with Stanley. So feel free to mentally do that. Scratch out Burnham, put in Ellul, you have the same point. And so that explains why Ellul is so pessimistic. So what is this idea, the technological society or the managerial society that we're talking about? That's what I'll explain a little bit more on the next slide. Okay, this point I also think I did manage to convey pretty well in class today. The connections between what Ellul called the technological society, what Burnham calls the managerial society, what Max Weber called the disenchanted world, and what a century before all of them, Karl Marx called the alienation produced by modern capitalism. All of these authors are thinking about the same thing, but they're using slightly different language to describe it. And what they're all referring to is modernity. Something about the modern world is deeply dissatisfying to human beings. Why? Why do we feel so alienated from one another and from our society? What is so dissatisfying about the modern world? And how does this relate to democracy and propaganda? Well, because democratic values and democracy are often in conflict with managerial values or the technological world. So remember how we talked about, a technique is the one best way to do something. It's efficient, it's standardized. These are the things that a managerial world values or technological world values. And those are so in contrast to how democracy works. I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. But my example in class was if you've ever been to an activisty meeting where, it's really grassroots, democratic, political activisty type of group, they're gonna do something like consensus decision making, right? That's the most democratic kind of decision making you can have. How long is that meeting gonna be? It's not going to be over in 20 minutes, right? That's what we mean about democracy is not the most efficient process. It takes time to come to consensus and to clarity about all of these different things. It's a long, messy process. So that's why these things are in conflict with one another, okay? Okay, so finally, to set you up a little bit more for chapter 2, just remember that chapter 2 is going to go into a lot more detail. So maybe if you missed some of the main points or didn't understand the introduction, it might become more clear after you read chapter 2. It's important to know that this chapter is going to focus on 2 claims that Stanley disputes. Meaning he disagrees with these 2 claims about propaganda. The first is the idea that propaganda can only be false information, that true information cannot be considered propaganda. He calls that the falsity condition. He says the falsity condition is false. Okay? The second thing is that that claim that he disputes about propaganda is that propaganda must only include insincere claims. In other words, it always has to be deceptive. He says no, actually. Propaganda can be completely sincerely held beliefs. So why is that? That's what he'll explain in chapter 2, Propaganda Defined. Now remember, he begins using different, more specific terminology here in chapter 2. He talks about supporting propaganda versus undermining propaganda. And that's where you have the distinction between, basically you can think of supporting propaganda as good propaganda and undermining propaganda as bad propaganda. Supporting propaganda is propaganda that supports the ideals it is intended to uphold. So in other words, using the language of freedom and democracy to create more freedom and democracy, right? Supporting propaganda, otherwise known as civic rhetoric. On the other hand, you have undermining propaganda, which is bad propaganda, which is what most of us think of when we use the term propaganda in everyday language, or if we call something propaganda, usually we're being critical of it, right? We're using it as a negative term. Well, that's because undermining propaganda undermines the ideals that it purports to uphold. So it uses the language of freedom and democracy in order to actually undermine freedom and democracy. Okay, so 2 different kinds of propaganda. One is good, one is bad. And then he says false ideologies mask the contradictions of the undermining propaganda. And that's why people can fall for it and really have no idea that they're falling for propaganda. And they can be professing completely sincerely held beliefs that are self-contradictory. And they will not notice that they are self-contradictory because of the propaganda. Okay, so I know this is a lot, you guys, but like I said, I cannot emphasize enough that you just have to go slow. You have to read it closely. You have to read it very carefully. You have to read it more than once. You have to pay attention to it because it's very deep. It's not easy to get, you guys, but don't get discouraged. I hope these videos are helpful, and I'll see you in class on Monday. Where we will do an in-class assignment that's specifically on Jason Stanley. So like I said, spend a lot of time with Stanley over this weekend. So get to know him very well so that when you come to class on Monday, you're ready to write an ICA on Jason Stanley, okay? And then we should be ready to start our in-class essay on Wednesday. All right, I'll see y'all then. Bye.